Now, European far-right parties made substantial gains in the European Union's parliamentary elections. In France and Germany, parties that were once considered to be on the fringes are now establishing themselves as viable challenges to the establishment. So what's driving this shift? And will these parties be able to turn their successes in these European elections into power at a national level?
Now to Austria, where the far-right Freedom Party is celebrating its first parliamentary election victory, winning around 29% of the vote, according to preliminary results. The party has vowed to create what it calls a fortress against migrants.
Welcome to the future of our former democracy. I'm Colin.
And I'm Heather Villanueva. Today, we're peeling back the onion on what it really means for a country to be gripped by far-right influence. It's not just Germany and the US. A lot of Europe is experiencing the unsettling reality of the rise of nationalism.
And there's some folks who are tempted to argue that nationalism just means that you love your country. You want your country to do well. What's wrong with nationalism? The problem is that that's rarely what nationalism actually is. And usually it's just a slippery slope towards anti-democratic and authoritarian policies.
It's the combination of ethnocentrism and nationalism all in one, also known as ethno-nationalism.
Because if you're a nationalist, you usually don't actually care about your borders and your flag and every single person within your country. There's a certain part of your country that you think is the right part of your country or the best part of your country, and that's what you're concerned about. We heard this exact same thing from Brendan, that for the National Socialists in Germany, the Nazis, that only some Germans were deemed the real Germans who really deserved to benefit from German society.
And we see the same thing with MAGA. It's not to make America great again for everyone who lives here. It's only for certain people who they deem deserving. And the others need to pay the price.
Personally, I want to live someday in like a Star Trek-styled utopia where energy concerns aren't an issue. We've solved world hunger. Folks can pursue the things that they're interested in, not for the sake of making money, but for the sake of contributing to their society.
A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We've eliminated hunger, want, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy.
And if we want to live in a sci-fi utopia like that someday, a prerequisite is that we learn to work together instead of dividing each other up into different groups and thinking everything has to be a zero-sum competition.
You know, when I was watching TNG as a young kid, I got to focus on the ethical dilemmas of how different species would interact with each other and how they would treat each other in a society that they were trying to make just, and that they had their own problems too, and they had to figure out their own ethical dilemmas. And a lot of times it was an analog for things that we as a country, as people, as subcultures within the United States have to grapple with as well. Cultural differences.
Totally. In the same way you grew up watching TNG, I grew up watching Voyager. And in sort of the same way, I was inspired by a vision for a future and a way we could come together. And I think maybe that's why seeing the rise of nationalism across the globe is particularly disheartening, not just in Germany, but right here at home in the US.
What is problematic is this feeling of inherent group superiority, that when you combine this feeling of cultural superiority or group superiority with systems and institutions that reinforce that superiority and oppress other people, that's when we're getting into trouble. And that's what we're seeing rise all over the world, and not just in Western nations.
And we've grappled with this both with the 1930s Germany motto of make Germany great again, and we see the same thing in the modern United States. When folks are talking about America first, which Americans are included in that America first mindset? It's not everyone who lives here.
The president today visited a new detention center in Florida. The facility, dubbed Alligator Alcatraz by local officials, is located at an airport in the Florida Everglades and is set to hold up to 5,000 beds.
In the United States, nationalism is leading to the creation of actual concentration camps in our country. They're trying to be cute by calling it something different, but what's happening in Texas, in Florida, and other places of the United States, there are for-profit prisons that are meant to disappear people from our communities, tear families apart, and take people away.
And in many cases, we don't actually know that they are being arrested by federal agents because they are wearing masks, are not producing ID or badges, and there's no way to verify who they are or where they're taking these people.
Yes, we know from history, and unfortunately, we see this happening today. Xenophobic language often leads to violent behavior, and often also, when it's in a nationalist context, leads to shameful action by the state or state violence in the service of national interests.
And as we're seeing some of these very real consequences of the othering of people within our society, I'm reminded of talking with Martin Lang, our Berlin tour guide, who spent many years working as a Holocaust educator, educating the German children about the realities of what the German government did back during the 1930s. We were standing outside at one point of the infamous Hitler bunker.
This is the bunker where Hitler famously killed himself at the end of the war, right?
That's right. And just sort of had a conversation about nationalism and his thoughts as a German, so aware of this context of history about being German and having German identity and what that meant to him.
Honestly, the time in which I grew up in the 90s still had a strong sense of don't be too proud to be German. And over the years, going into the 2000s, you're like, all right, we got it now, right? It's not like I'm proud to be German, right? That feels weird because it's obviously not something I achieved or something. But over the 2000s, you see whenever there's a big football tournament, which is our major sport, right? Be it a Euro Cup or a World Cup, this is the only time when people feel confident waving the German flag around. I never did. I just never did. I still find it very awkward to be proud to be not just German. I would find it weird for any nation, right? Especially Western nations, privileged white people. Of course, you can be happy and content where you are, right? You can be happy about your family and your job and everything, but proud to be a national of a certain country always goes in that direction to exclude others.
I can really relate to this. I admit to having some national pride being a part of a country who has these ideals for freedom of expression, freedom of the press, the ability to pursue justice.
Like the principles.
Yes. And at the same time, I don't want to forget all of the things that people had to do in order to fight to get and maintain those rights. Japanese Americans, for example, were interned. In our recent history, were sent to concentration camps. And some of those same people and others fought for that to not happen again. And they're still alive today. What is interesting is that often national identity is unearned. And when it's linked to ethnocentrism, it becomes dangerous. National pride just for the sake of being a part of a nation.
For the borders that you were born into.
Right, is kind of fraught. It is true that there are people who feel national pride because of all of the arduous steps that they have taken to become an American.
Or for accomplishments like in science.
And that I don't want to take away the meaningfulness of that. But having national pride just because of the unearned alignment that you have with the race that America must be excludes people of color and excludes anyone who is outside of that archetype. And when baked into the systems of a country and the institutions and the way that it operates, it has the effect of systemically othering in a way that is truly oppressive.
And Martin's point about like being German or being American isn't something that you achieved. So it's weird to be proud. Like you can be proud of, winning a race or making something beautiful or working really hard. And I think one other reason that having pride in sort of the abstract thing of the borders that you were born within can be kind of odd sometimes is because what your nation isn't consistent. It doesn't have consistent values or leadership or goals. Political leaders come and go. They change with the times. And that all sort of gets at the heart of what's always made me a little bit uncomfortable with this whole notion of nationalism. And I think that's all part of why electoral systems are so important.
We have to create these strong and resilient systems for democracy because if and when people forget about the crimes that were committed in the name of ethno-nationalism, these safeguards are what society can fall back on in order to maintain a democratic society. And from the end of World War II until recently, Germany seemed actually quite resilient to these anti-democratic threats.
One aspect that I value about the German system is the emphasis on party politics and not people. That just makes it a bit less prone to populism. Although, of course, there are populist parties, but I think Germany has learned a lot from Hitler in that regard and his seizure of power.
That's Dr. Bera Ebert. She's a political science faculty member and director of public programs and strategic initiatives at Bard College Berlin, and she was also the chief academic sponsor of our learning tour.
Every time we had nationalism, protectionism, closed borders, it didn't end so well, both in terms of, geopolitics and finances and all of that. So it's kind of as if an entire party and their supporters and their potential electorate have forgotten what has happened over the past 100 years.
So far this season, we've focused largely on the first half of the 20th century in Germany, the rocky start of democracy that was quickly manipulated and turned to fascism by Hitler and the Nazis, the Holocaust that followed, as well as a war that ravaged Germany, Europe, Japan, and much of the world.
So at this point in history, coming out of World War II, we're entering the post-war era. It's 1949, and West Germany has become its own country, supported by the Allied powers, France, Britain, and especially the US, and East Germany has also become its own country, primarily supported by the USSR. Now, some say that during this era, democracy and capitalism saved West Germany after the destruction of World War II. And in this episode, we're going to look at how the legacy that comes from this time of division leads to some real challenges of German democracy today.
I think if you're someone who grew up during the Cold War like I did, this might be common sense that East and West Germany were two different countries, and it was a proxy war between what was going on between the US and Russia.
Capitalism versus communism.
But younger folks might not be aware that for about 40 years, Germany was two different countries, and it was two radically different countries in a lot of ways.
And in the same way as the United States was pouring money and resources into the West, the USSR was pouring a bunch of resources into East Germany. There was literally a wall built around Berlin in the 60s to make sure the communist half of Berlin couldn't touch or interact with the capitalist part of West Berlin. And these two different paths that they go on for 40 years leads to two parts of one country today that are very different and have very different histories and cultural memories and politics, frankly.
We've seen that divide in the way that politics shows up today. In the elections in February, the snap elections, they saw an unprecedented rise in the support for Germany's far-right extremist populist party, the AfD. And they're now the second place party with about 20% of the vote.
And you can see, if you look at a map of the 2025 federal election results, former East Germany does vote differently from former West Germany. Here, Heather, let me actually pull up a map. Okay. What do you see?
Well, it's blue on the right and gray on the left and a little red in the middle.
Yeah.
It's clearly marketed. It's clearly marketed. The right and the left, the East and the West, are voting very differently. And there's a very clear line.
And so here's maybe where this notion of parallels to America can really clearly be seen. If you think about former East Germany sort of as the cultural equivalent of the South, and you start thinking about how we can see, in a presidential election results map, these really clear divisions between where the red states are and where the blue states are, you can kind of see something really similarly here. And you can see that where East Germany once stood is where the AfD is at its strongest. That the electoral borders today reflect the physical borders of the past. And those borders only fell in 1991. We can see today that there's growing support for far-right extremist politics, and there's dog whistle tactics, and much worse coming from the right in Germany. So it's worth exploring how Germany's legacy of division, the 40-year split between East and West, might all be a factor in this today. And similarly, exploring what parallels we can see in the United States and why our politics is so polarized and that there are areas that staunchly support our current swing towards far-right authoritarianism. Geopolitical differences can be seen on a map that are linked to some cultural division in history,
right,
that now in the present day are manifesting as supporting two different parts of the political spectrum.
So we're saying that the Berlin Wall is gone, Germany has been reunified for over 30 years, but the effects of that divide remain, especially for those who missed out on opportunities for advancement.
ProPublica reporter Alec McGillis has reported extensively on this issue.
What Germany does have is a different sort of regional problem, which is quite bluntly the problem of the East. And that you have the former East Germany, the former GDR, that has now decades after reunification is really struggled to, quote, catch up with the West, and where you still have all sorts of very complex feelings of resentment stemming from reunification. At the time of reunification, you had a country that had for decades been operating under completely different economic systems, and where you had an attempt by the West to bring the Eastern states into its form of capitalist democracy. And in doing so, of course, you had all sorts of investment, just staggering levels of investment in the East for years and years, to the point where when you're now traveling or reporting in the East and you go to some of these, quote, left behind cities, they are in strikingly better shape than their equivalent left behind cities in the US. Having spent a lot of time in both places, it's so striking just how much better things look superficially in these Eastern cities and towns than an equivalent left behind town or city in the Midwest or Appalachia. And so you had that extraordinary investment of a sort that has not occurred in the US in left behind places. But nonetheless, you still had astonishingly high levels of population decline, especially young people leaving for Western cities in Germany, leaving from the East for Western cities. And so you have a region like a state like Thuringia, where that's experienced nearly a population decline of nearly a fifth since reunification, and just a real sense that things have fallen off, that people have left, that there's not enough people around, that things have emptied out. So you have its resentment over that basic loss of vitality. You have resentment over the companies that after reunification simply were liquidated. I mean, there was this extraordinary period in the early 90s where there was an attempt by West Germany to keep businesses going in the East as much as possible, but still inevitably you had companies that were either just massively downsized or extinguished altogether in that transition to capitalist economy without state subsidies. And so there's still resentment over that.
A lot of these issues stem from the fact that in a lot of ways, East Germany was kind of left behind after the war. Capitalism and foreign aid flooded into West Germany under the Marshall Plan as part of the US's strategy in the Cold War to help jumpstart this incredible German economy. But in the East, where they were effectively under Soviet rule, although they were quote-unquote independent, they really missed out on generations of economic advancement and generational wealth building, and the Soviet Union just wasn't capable of pumping as much money or as many resources into East Germany as the rest of the Allied powers were pumping money into the West. And as a result, East Germany lost a lot of major companies and people, frankly, that it had been proud of in its early post-war years. Companies and people fleeing to the West because they didn't want to be stuck behind the Iron Curtain.
So there was just this real built-up resentment over decades of a proud industrial legacy having been lost from the East to the West. And then on top of that, you still have to this day markedly different levels of pay. Salary levels are much higher in the West than in the East. And so you just have this real sense of being second class, of being looked down on. I spent one night in Thuringia and just found myself at a little cafe talking for hours with a large group of friends that kind of gathered there, ages from 20 to 60, I'd say. And it was just incredibly politically sort of diverse group and very thoughtful people. But the one thing that kind of held them together was this real sense, even among these quite educated denizens there, of a real feeling of resentment and being looked down on by people just states just a little bit to the west. Mining is very close to the old east-west border. And even there, you just had this real feeling of a kind of bitterness over the fact that they were still lagging behind the Western states, even though they were basically mining. And if you look on a map, it's like almost in the center of the country, but it's, quote, in the east. And so things are lagging and the population is so much lower than it used to be. And there's still this real ill will over that.
It's interesting to think of former East Germany and the U.S. South within this context of war, economics, and politics, right? We can't make one-to-one comparisons. It's complex, but both regions were on the losing end of a war, the Cold War in Germany, and in the case of the U.S., the Civil War.
Right. And in both countries, there's sort of this stereotype that the side that lost the war, former East Germany and the U.S. South, are impoverished, uneducated, dumb, undeveloped, culturally unsophisticated. And in both places, folks are aware of those stereotypes and they don't like them. And they feel like folks from the other regions look down on them, are condescending, are holier than thou. It's sort of the notion of, a coastal elite or someone from an urban city who thinks he's better than everyone else.
And white Americans, regardless of geography, do have struggles economically and in other ways, but they're being presented with a retelling of the story of race in the United States, where white people are on the losing end, especially white Americans from the South.
There are literally parts of the United States where curriculum is being revised to emphasize the, quote, both sidesism of slavery, to talk about the positives that came along with it, that's trying to downplay the reality of the Jim Crow South and to downplay the reality of Jim Crow America and all the policies of racial division that happened after Martin Luther King had his famous dream. And it's done from this perspective of hurting white people's feelings and that we're talking about race too much and it's time to move on. People of color and wokeness have all gone too far.
Reverse racism.
Yeah, it's exactly that. Exactly that notion.
And now it's white people who are being left behind and being discriminated and oppressed, especially white men. But in reality, it's poor people of all races that are getting left behind and oppressed.
It's also probably worth teasing out that even though there are some of these parallels between the East-West divide in Germany and the North-South or Red-Blue divide in the US, there are also plenty of obvious differences. So again, want to reemphasize, we're not saying it's a one-to-one comparison, but that there are legacies of division and differences in history and economic opportunity that still influence politics today.
And not all voters think alike in any region or any country. So for Germans supporting the Alternative for Germany, the far-right AfD party, the former East Germany is not a monolith.
There were AfD voters in West Germany. And there were a lot of people who voted for the center and left parties in the former East Germany. In fact, the AfD didn't receive a majority of the vote in any single district. And, likewise in the US, there are people who vote for Democrats in red states, and there are people who vote for Republicans in blue states. And so, although we can look at this map of Germany and we can see, the former East has these different voting patterns, it's exciting and it's interesting, and it doesn't fully capture the picture. So it's important to know that in every single district, most Germans voted against the AfD. And because Germany doesn't have an electoral college, because they use a proportional system, it's not winner take all. If you get some votes, you're going to get some seats. If we were to have a system like this in the United States, and you were a Democrat in Alabama or a Republican in Los Angeles, your vote wouldn't just not count because you know for sure who's going to win and it's the other side. You could still help elect somebody.
In federal elections, each German gets to vote for each party who they want to have seats in the Bundestag. And because they have a parliamentary system with governing coalitions, voting for a smaller party doesn't mean throwing your vote away.
So again, it looks on a map like the AfD swept East Germany because it's all blue, the color of their party. But all that tells you is that the AfD got a plurality in East Germany, which means they got more votes than any other party, but not a majority. Both things can be true at the same time. And you can see that same idea paralleled in US elections. You look at a map of the presidential election 2024, and it looks like the entirety of the South voted for Donald Trump, except we know for a fact that there's a lot of folks in those states who voted for Kamala Harris or who wrote in an independent candidate. But under a winner-take-all election, getting the most votes means you get everything. And so it seems like everyone there voted for Trump. And likewise, it might look like there's not a single Trump supporter in New York City or on the West Coast. But we know that there's a lot of folks there who did vote for Trump. Our winner-take-all elections just distort that reality and make it look like it's us versus them, one or the other, zero-sum.
All right, so let's return to this idea of nationalism and Germany first or America first politics, because in both countries, the issue of immigration was a major talking point in recent election cycles. And when we look at the rise of the far right, we have to look at how there is increasing scapegoating of immigrants, even in places with relatively smaller immigrant populations, like much of Eastern Germany.
You know, it's very similar, of course, to what we've seen in the U.S., where you have very strong anti-immigrant feeling in parts of the U.S. that have very few immigrants. And I think the best way to make sense of it is that you have places that were already feeling, left behind and troubled, and then seeing, even if it's elsewhere in the country, seeing resources going to these other people who have been coming across the border. And even if they're not really there where you are in Ohio or in Appalachia, you're still going to feel resentment over it.
Alec added that we shouldn't just simplify this to an urban-rural divide, that there's more to it.
It should be noted that this dynamic has changed somewhat recently, I think in both countries. In both countries, you're now seeing the right, whether it's the AfD or the Trump Republican Party, doing better in more urban places that have actually experienced a huge part of the migrant surge.
In the U.S., we saw this bear out in blue cities like New York. Political stunts by red state governors to send migrants to so-called sanctuary cities helped fuel headlines and stoke fear about undocumented immigrants. And we saw in some places like Queens and the Bronx in New York that people actually swung for Trump, that there was increased support for Trump and anti-immigration policies.
In Germany, it's been less dramatic. The big cities, whether in the East or the West, remain strongly anti-AfD. But you have seen in some mid-sized cities, there's a very good story recently out of Pforzheim in southwestern Germany, a city of about 120,000 people that is, in the very quite prosperous Baden-Württemberg region that has seen a sharp rise in the share of the AfD vote in parallel with it having a really disproportionately large migrant population in Pforzheim. And so I do think going forward, you're going to see the anti-migrant vote showing up more in places that actually have lots of migrants. And so less of that sort of that irony that you had until now, where it was more in the places where they weren't, that the right wing was doing the best.
The polarization in Germany mirrors the US in some major ways, and yet they aren't facing the same sort of existential crisis as us. At least not yet, not as deeply. For now, despite the rises of the AfD, the centrist parties have formed a governing coalition without the far right. And for now, it seems like the firewall is holding.
And this all sort of comes back to this first order question that we keep raising about electoral systems. If you take a look at the 2016 Republican primaries, Trump never actually receives a majority of the vote from Republican voters, but he receives a plurality, more votes than anyone else. And because of this, and because of how our two-party winner-take-all elections work in the United States, he's able to take over the Republican Party and sort of remake the Republican Party in his image. The Republican Party of today looks nothing like the more center-right party of a decade ago. And further, because of winner-take-all elections, this minority of Republicans who takes over the Republican Party then takes over the entire United States government. And the center-right is evaporated.
Contrast that with Germany in 2025. The AfD did get 20% of the vote, but they were not able to get governing power of the entire country. A vocal far-right minority was contained. At least it is contained for now.
And the center-right continues to operate in Germany. They weren't wiped out by the AfD's success.
Okay, but that same popular center-right party, the Christian Democratic Union, or CDU, they have moved significantly to the right since Angela Merkel stepped down as chancellor in 2021. The current leader of the CDU, Friedrich Merz, ran on promises of some pretty hardline anti-immigration policies and has made some really alarming comments, suggesting that he would actually consider working with the far right, the AfD. The firewall, the very thing meant to keep the far right from once again taking over Germany, is under active threat.
for the CDU to take up the arguments from the AfD, this is shocking.
Birrett was perplexed talking about how the CDU started moving to the right, because it was the party of Angela Merkel, like you said, a famously pro-refugee, pro-migrant party that has recently become much more hostile to migrants and has talked about rolling back some of those very same policies.
The CDU was the leading party in the beginnings of European integration. It was the leading party in bringing Germany back on the international stage. It was the leading party of the center for very many years. So there is a break of a German centrist political party tradition, not to form a coalition with the far-right parties. That was sort of a silent agreement.
All this to say, the AfD does present some real challenges to the firewall, not just through their ability to try to contest for power, but the fact that the popularity of their policies is motivating some center-right politicians to go further right.
So let's talk more about the AfD. Where did this far-right party come from?
So they're a relatively new party. They were founded in 2013, but they've been steadily gaining popularity. And a lot of this is connected to Angela Merkel's pro-migrant policies. She said, we can do this. There is a crisis in Syria, and Germany can help. And essentially, she offered an open-door policy, saying that Germany can receive migrants and help. This led to a lot of backlash from members of the right who felt like the center-right party that she was a part of were no longer right enough. And so they start supporting the AfD. Martin said that a lot has changed because the AfD has steadily gained support from people who feel underrepresented by politicians. And so as a result, these folks who were at the fringes have started being able to move into the spotlight. And meanwhile, they've ramped up their explicitly extremist platforms and talking points and are targeting immigrants. And they're espousing this uncomfortably familiar notion of Germany first nationalism.
They are difficult because they have moved from a serious right-wing party as they started 10 years ago or more, and they moved to an extremist party, right? They're right-wing extremists. And this is not my personal opinion. This is what an institution called Verfassungsschutz it's an institution that is directed by our Supreme Court, so to say, or Constitutional Court. They have, categorized them as clearly anti-constitutional and therefore watch many of them, those members on state and federal levels with actual Secret Service means, tap their phones and everything. And besides all the little scandals that one guy, receives money from a Russian agent or from a Chinese agent, both things happened last year. Besides all of that, they're becoming more and more open about their plans to change our constitution, to end democracy, to end pluralism, to reverse some of the things that have recently been passed, like the self-determination law just last year in November, that people can choose freely what gender, what sex they want to have in their passport or ID. They would reverse that immediately, stuff like that, right? So this is exactly the stuff. And then, of course, they use clear Nazi methods. Like just a few weeks ago, people with migration background in, I think it was Karlsruhe in the southwest of the country, found letters, fake plane tickets, go back home, one-way ticket back home or whatever, printed on it. And that's exactly what a former Nazi party in the 90s did and what the Nazis did with fake train tickets for Jewish people in the 1930s, right? So this is, they're not even hiding it anymore, right? And there's so many, especially for somebody who's quite involved with Holocaust education, all the relativizing and playing down of the Nazi period is not just hurtful, it is dangerous. Nothing else but dangerous, right? And the AfD does that in so many different ways.
So, Colin, the AfD, are they Nazis?
Good question. And I asked Martin that point blank. We were passing through a quiet lobby of a building near the Brandenburg Gate, and I asked him, are the AfD just Nazis?
Yes, 100%. Even the court ruled when the AfD went after a journalist who called them Nazis. They went for him to, stop calling Nazis. It was years ago, 7, 8 years ago. And the court ruled if it sounds like a Nazi and it looks like a Nazi and it says Nazi things, it's a Nazi. Obviously, they don't call themselves Nazis, right? Because that's a bad look, but they clearly are, right?
Oh, and actually, this is one element I am hoping you can speak to. I talked with you about this earlier in her Twitter live stream with Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Alice
Weidel
said, "How can we be a Nazi party when the Nazis were socialists and we're on the right wing?" Can you just for our American audience explain why that's BS?
That is something that comes up every couple of years. It's ridiculous. In the early 1920s, Hitler has joined the German Workers' Party, and he realizes immediately that obviously have to appeal to the working class. So German Workers' Party may not be enough of a name, right? The Social Democrats get way too many votes and the Communists do. So why don't we call ourselves National Socialist German Workers' Party, right? That should, tick all the boxes. It's marketing, nothing else, right? And it works. Hitler is always on the nationalist side, obviously, and makes sure that the socialist side is killed way before the Nazi party plays an actual role in the political landscape, right? So they're clearly nationalists, right? They're anti-Semitic, they're anti-communist, they're anti-imperialist, they're all these things. And they have nothing to do with socialism. Hitler later explained that National Socialism, he understands in a way that nationalism is what people bring in for the greater good, and socialism is what they get out of it, right? That they have jobs and, welfare, whatever, stuff like that. But this is exactly the reason why again and again, they're called socialists and they only wanted good things for the people, and it's absolutely ridiculous. It's always populists who make those claims, right, to fire things up in a way. But with Alice Weidel, don't believe one word she says, right? She's the biggest hypocrite, the biggest political opportunist that you will ever see, right?
Martin said AfD supporters gotten some hot water for being, let's say, clever with their campaign language. They used a play on words which really alluded to a banned Nazi slogan, Alles für Deutschland.
It means everything for Germany. A good nationalist slogan if I've ever heard one.
There were AfD rallies where people started chanting Alles für Deutschland, all for Germany, which is an SA slogan, right? Printed, shouted everywhere, right? So der Verfassungsschutz, the constitutional protective institution, did go into that and looked for the people responsible for that. So now they changed it to Alles für Deutschland, right? So not everything or all for Deutschland, but alles für Deutschland. And it's just this clever way of twisting things. Oh yeah, that's what they said, of course, right? But again, still, referring to that old Nazi phrase.
What do you do about a far-right party using Nazi slogans and overtly flirting with extremist politics? Martin made the case that Germany should use its unique constitutional ability to ban political parties that demonstrate a real potential to harm democracy itself.
There has to be a potential for them to even do something about our democracy. And that is certainly given with the AfD now, right? Actually, everything is given with the AfD now. So people really want to move, but a lot of people are afraid you cannot start making a party that wins over 20% illegal. But I just read a commentary of a guy who said, this is exactly the biggest fault, right? Of course you can. If this is an anti-democratic, party, but still gets a lot of support, you still have to defend democracy, right? Because people obviously don't vote for the AfD because they want to get rid of that current system, right? A lot of people probably are not even aware or don't take it too seriously what that would actually mean, right?
So the AfD is clearly on the line. They're not on the line.
Over the line.
They're over the line on far-right extremism. They've been categorized by Germany's constitutional court as anti-constitutional, and Germany is unique in that it can actually constitutionally ban an anti-democratic party. But it may be too late. the cat might already be out of the bag, and banning a political party, especially one that enjoys 20% popularity throughout the country, could be really tricky.
What exactly does a ban cause? Because you can ban a party, but you can't ban the people and the attitudes and the people and the ideology. So a ban has to go along with addressing grievances. Otherwise, this doesn't work.
Nicola Hieke, who heads the Bavarian office that monitors far-right extremism and helps respond to hate crimes, said that at this point, she doesn't think banning the party would actually have the intended effect.
So for us, we thought even if the AfD is banned, it would probably only have a little bit of an impact on our counseling and advice cases and people phoning in, because the actors are still out there. Then, on the other hand, the AfD, as soon as they come to power, can, if you aren't careful here, they can actually change the constitution. They can actually do things like abolish some things quickly. And the democratic constitution always isn't the strongest to withhold this. So they can abuse that power. And to a certain degree, there's certainly people in it that would. And of course, trying to ban them before they come to power for extremism. And this is now the definition of the intelligence service, is not mine. That means they are collecting evidence for like months now, and it's piling up of really extremist, anti-constitutional behavior within the AfD. But it's very difficult because you need it from 16 states, and you need to prove that it's not only single people, but a party strategy. So I don't think it will solve the problem. Of course, in a way, it would be great because it cuts off all financing, and it will take years for them to come back from this blow. And I think it would make the country a lot safer, but it isn't a solution to the problem because everything that gets banned in this country comes up somewhere else.
And Nicola put an even finer point on it, saying the potential backlash of banning the AfD could be really dangerous.
And it probably also at the stage now leads to an enormous not a further radicalization, but I think some people are willing to use violence. And so you have to take this into consideration as well. And then what do you do with the 30%, 35% in Thüringen, Brandenburg, all these states that voted for the party and that already probably are experiencing some sort of deprivation? Not everybody does. I want to say this, that most people voting for the AfD know what they stand for, and it's not a protest vote, but you need to address this somehow. So banning is probably, I like the fact that Germany has the debate. It's the only country that has that debate. I think we are also the only country that comes from a very specific history, which is why I think we have that debate. And it's necessary to have. I'm not sure if it will be successful. They already said it will take years. And the whole country is pretty much divided over this, whether to do it or not. But even if they do it, it might fail. And what then? That would be propaganda-wise an absolute win for them.
The prospect of banning a political party, from where I stand as an American, kind of makes me recoil a little bit. It's like the political suppression has been used in this country against people of color over and over again, from infiltrating the Black Panthers to, the entire McCarthy era.
Right.
But in the German context, I see how they feel a need for a concrete mechanism to shut down anything that could lead to another human rights disaster, to another genocide. Their electoral system, mixed member proportional, MMP, has prevented a far-right takeover of their government until now. But they still appear vulnerable, and their mechanism of banning a political party outright isn't a sure thing.
And political scientist Thomas Schwendt said that it's a really tricky debate because you want a democracy, right? And so the emergence of new parties that represent people who feel like the existing parties don't represent them is sort of the point. Like, that's what's supposed to happen.
Right.
And so what does a democracy do when a non-insignificant chunk of the population don't want democracy? Like, what's the democratic solution to that question? But in Germany, there is this obvious historic special sensitivity to the risks that you're trying to mitigate against from extremists, particularly far-right extremists, coming into power.
Germany, of all the countries, are very sensitive, even talking to right-wing politicians. That's kind of you don't want to do this. It's just not what we do, what we are used to do, right? So for us, having a right-wing party in parliament is already disturbing. Really, it's disturbing. And of course, those people who vote for this party, they don't like the system. They want to disturb us, the majority, and or want to communicate at least that they're not, they don't feel sufficiently represented in society or in politics. And there are potentially good reasons for this. So the existing parties didn't do a good job in taking care of particular issues. So this is why new parties emerge, right? If there's a representation gap, if there are issues that are not addressed, or even worse, not solved, then in a PR system, the likelihood that a new party forms with the agenda, let's solve this issue, is really high. And this is what is so great about PR, essentially, right? Because if there's an issue, if the existing parties don't do a good job, there will be new parties that solve it and everyone is happy. But, this is out of our range of acceptability. So we have a constitution, we have a political culture, and this is so far off. And therefore, but the problem in PR is you cannot just, or in a democracy is you cannot just tell the courts you should forbid them, right? It's a dilemma situation because you always want to give the freedom for new parties to develop. On the other hand, what happens if there are actors out there, political entrepreneurs, who use this freedom to reduce actually freedom on all the others, right? That's kind of a dilemma situation. And this is what we have here.
The rise of the far right is a real dilemma for Germany. It's a real problem, and I don't want to understate that. I felt that while our learning tour was there during the February election. But even despite all of that, I still feel inspired that their system that allows for many parties and higher voter participation and essentially forced compromise among politicians is better than the way we do things here. At the end of the day, extremist politics on any side of the spectrum have a harder time taking over control of an entire country because of their systems, even if it's not perfect. And while I was there in Germany and since coming home, I've continued to watch failure after failure of our system. There has to be a better way. And I don't want to accept that it just has to be this way.
We see a path through some form of proportional representation where those people, particularly Black and brown folks, Indigenous and immigrant, queer folks, trans folks, and all those folks who have been left behind, including poor white folks, can see our political power be at least equivalent to the power currently held by the ultra-rich, corporations, and generational power holders. And we can start by solving our societal problems to serve our interests instead of to empower the few. But what if giving political power to the smaller pockets of the U.S. population actually means giving some political power to those pockets of the U.S. population who truly hate Jewish people, truly hate Black people and immigrants and women and queer people, and truly hate the idea of democracy?
And that notion is, I think, one of the biggest pushbacks we hear in our work in the United States advocating for proportional representation is this notion that extremists will get elected. If you only need 5% of the vote, 10% of the vote to get a seat in Congress, you are guaranteed to have at least one or two members of Congress who are members of the American Nazi Party. And in their name on CNN, in parentheses, it'll say N. And that makes some folks really deeply uncomfortable. And I get it, that isn't comfortable. At the same time, though, for me, the sort of critical takeaway is that if you look at the seat map of the U.S. Senate today, where there's two groups, there's red dots and blue dots. We already know that some of those red dots effectively are members of the American Nazi Party. They have the exact same anti-immigrant views. They support the exact same notions of white supremacy and racial exclusion. But They get to wrap themselves in the legitimacy of the cloak of the party of John McCain and Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney. And it's really hard to see who they are. But when you look at the seat map of the Bundestag, you know which of those dots, which 24% of the parliament are the far-right extremists and who aren't. And I think that is really empowering. And I think that the greater danger is not knowing who they are and then being able to, hide as a wolf, if not in sheep's clothing, at least a center-right person's clothing. And I think it's pretty clear in the U.S. that that's happening. The far right has taken over the Republican Party. People like Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney have openly said that they no longer feel welcome, that the party doesn't represent them. And there are a lot of voters who in polls say that they identify as Republicans, but that they think folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and Donald Trump are too far right for them. But now there's nowhere for them to go because they also aren't Democrats.
Exactly. Here in the U.S., the far right is not on the fringes. They are fully in power, stacking the courts, eroding the Constitution, arresting politicians, arresting judges, persecuting political dissidents.
Sending people to concentration camps, literal, by definition, concentration camps.
Exactly. And our German friends like Barrett are really worried about us. It's really disturbing that they are the ones that are worried about us.
Yeah.
It tells us where we are.
It is shocking when you read what is coming over from the United States. I'm in general an optimist. I would be astonished if a population that had such a strong democratic and participatory tradition falls for that on the long run. I'm talking about the United States. I'm trying to be positive about the United States for you. You see some action happening in the courts, but come on. This entire country cannot just passively sit there and wait until, something is over. Perhaps you want to go into politics and do something about it.
We have to face that nationalism, racism, and capitalism are forces that we have to reckon with and grapple with in the U.S. for generations to come.
There will always be people in a society who want to do harm.
Right. And this is a part of our journey, right? We can't expect to live in a perfect democracy right now. The point is that we are always striving for freedom for all.
For a more perfect union.
For a more equitable democracy. But under a system of proportional representation, it is actually harder for an extreme vocal minority touting extremely racist, xenophobic, and anti-democratic views to take over the government unchecked. And no matter what, we need to share our country, right? At the end of the day. This is something they said in Ireland. At the end of the day, who was it?
Jerry Lynch.
Jerry Lynch. At the end of the day, Jerry Lynch. We all have to live in the same country. We are still neighbors.
Whether we like each other or not.
We have to learn how to coexist. Our organization, More Equitable Democracy, believes that a system that forces multiple ruling factions to work together to solve a country's problems can at least get us closer to a system that will serve everyone better.
And that's why we do what we do. That's why, to us, electoral systems are a first-order question. Because if you want your democracy to be better at solving problems, you need to make your democracy better.
More Equitable Democracy is a racial justice organization seeking to make our democracy more proportionally representative. We see election reforms as a key element on the long path towards justice for all. So next episode, we're going to talk about how race, identity, and belonging show up in German politics today. As we've said, the election campaigns in both Germany and the United States used immigration as a major talking point. But the truth is that this sort of othering politics has a long history of scapegoating and fear-mongering.
So the question is, how does all that play out in a country with a different racial history, and one that explicitly teaches the horrors of xenophobic fascism as part of its required curriculum?
And perhaps more importantly, we want to hear directly from Germans with migration backgrounds about how they feel about their system of government and representation.
That's next on The Future of Our Former Democracy.
The Future of Our Former Democracy is a production of More Equitable Democracy and Large Media. That's LARJ Media. Our producer-editors are Maria Paleologos and Isaac Kaplan-Woolner, with help from Corrine Kiltow. Sean Simmons engineered the show. Tina Knoll is principal and head of creative at Large Media, fact-checking by Martin Lang. Special thanks to Faith Ombadi, George Chung, and Marty Reamer. If you like what you've heard today, please share this episode with someone you think needs to hear it. Personal recommendations are still the best way to get the word out. And of course, rate and review the show. It really does help. For links and more information on today's episode, check out the show notes at www.equitabledemocracy.org.
Wow, this episode is deep.
This episode of our podcast?
No, this episode of Star Trek. Pen pals. That's a deep cut that you found. That Star Trek episode?
I'm gonna listen to it later, but I found a 2-minute clip called Utopian Society, Star Trek: The Next Generation. Jean-Luc Picard and Data explain to others life and society of their time.
Oh man, I was so tempted. Stay on target. Stay on target.
Star Wars.
Okay. We're total nerds.